Evelyn Harper never believed the suburbs could hide real danger, and her neighbor, Marcus Lane, seemed just like any other quiet resident until the night the red light appeared in his window, and everything Evelyn thought was safe began to unravel. I always thought the suburbs were safe. The streets were wide, lined with identical houses, and the lawns were meticulously trimmed, like someone had pressed pause on perfection. At night, the faint sound of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a dog made it feel almost peaceful, almost normal. I had lived here for years, always telling myself that nothing truly bad could ever happen in a place like this. I was wrong. It started with the light. I first noticed it late one night, while lying in bed, staring out my bedroom window. Across the street, in the house directly opposite mine, one of the windows glowed with a strange pulsing light. It wasn't the warm yellow of a lamp or the soft blue of a television. This light was different. It throbbed in irregular patterns, dimming and brightening like a heartbeat, casting shadows across the walls inside the house. I pressed my forehead against the glass, trying to convince myself it was nothing, an odd reflection, a faulty bulb. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. For a long time I just watched. I didn't move. The streets were empty, silent, except for the whisper of wind through the trees. And then, I saw it. A shape, tall and unnerving, standing just behind the red glow of the window. It didn't move, didn't shift, didn't do anything except exist there, impossibly still. Its outline was vaguely human, but something about it was wrong. The proportions were off, elongated and thin, like a shadow that had grown too large for its form. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My eyes were glued to it, my chest tightening as a slow, creeping dread filled my body. The next morning, the house looked normal. There was no light, no sign of anything unusual. The driveway was empty, the curtains drawn. Nothing in the daylight gave any hint of the terror that had crept in the night before. I told myself I had imagined it. My mind was playing tricks after all, I reasoned, but a feeling of unease stayed with me, a prickling on the back of my neck, a sensation that something was watching me even in broad daylight. By the second night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I found myself sitting at the edge of my bed, staring across the street, waiting for the light to return. When it did, I nearly dropped my phone, nearly fell to the floor with the shock. The glow was stronger now, more insistent, like it had noticed me. The figure had shifted closer to the window, as if it were aware of my gaze. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat a frantic drum of fear. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything to escape the feeling that something in that house was alive and aware. But I was frozen. I watched it for what felt like hours. The shape didn't blink or breathe, but I could sense its presence pressing toward me through the night. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was just a person inside, maybe a neighbor I didn't know well, standing too close to the window. But then I realized, no one in our neighborhood ever stood at their windows at night, and no one ever let their lights pulse red like that. When I finally forced myself to look away, I felt a chill creep up my spine. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind replayed the image over and over, the tall, thin shape. The way the red light seemed almost like blood spilling across the glass. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, standing silently, watching, waiting. The next morning, I noticed something odd in my yard. There were faint, narrow footprints pressed into the soil, as if someone or something had walked around the house while I slept. The pattern wasn't human. They were too long, too thin, too deliberate. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach churning. How could anyone have gotten into my yard without me noticing? And why had the footprints stopped directly beneath my bedroom window, as if marking the exact spot where I had been watching? I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself I was losing my mind, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. That night I stayed awake, afraid of what might appear, afraid to blink, and then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., it came back. The light, the red glow. Only this time it was brighter, almost painful to look at, and behind it the shape had moved closer, pressing against the glass. I could feel it, a presence that was patient but hungry, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to watch. And as I stared, frozen in terror, I realized with a shiver that this was only the beginning. I tried to tell myself it had all been in my head, a trick of exhaustion or an overactive imagination. Maybe the red glow and the tall figure were nothing more than shadows cast by a faulty lamp or the trees swaying outside. But that rationalization did nothing to ease the creeping fear that had settled into my chest, heavy and unrelenting. By the time night fell again, I realized that avoiding the window wouldn't save me. I could feel it waiting, somehow aware of whether I looked or not, as though it could see me even when I closed my eyes. I stayed in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my body stiff with tension. The clock ticked closer to 2:14 a.m., the time the light had always appeared. My hands trembled as I gripped the sheets, trying to convince myself I wouldn't look this time. But when the first pulse of red spilled across the curtains, my eyes betrayed me. I had to see it, even though every instinct screamed for me to run, to hide, to tear myself away from the window. The glow was stronger than ever, seeping into the room, bleeding along the walls and ceiling like ink dropped into water. The shape was there again, taller, darker, somehow closer. I couldn't make out features, only the impossibly thin silhouette that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the window. It didn't move, didn't blink, but its presence pressed against me, heavy and suffocating. I felt as if the air itself had thickened, trapping me in a cage of fear. I wanted to scream, to call for someone, anyone, but no sound came out. My voice felt gone, swallowed by the darkness that radiated from that window. My body was frozen, caught in a terror that I couldn't fight or run from. And then, as I leaned closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop, a shadow moving inside the shape, like something alive was crawling beneath its skin. It pulsed with the light, stretching and twisting in impossible ways, a grotesque silent dance that made me recoil in horror. When I finally tore myself away, stumbling backward into the safety of my bed, I felt exhausted in every fiber of my being. Sleep was impossible. Every sound in the house felt magnified. The creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the distant buzz of a street lamp outside. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the red glow to return, waiting for the thing to reappear. The next day was no reprieve. I walked through the neighborhood in a daze, my eyes constantly flicking to windows, porches, and shadows. The streets seemed empty, unnervingly quiet, and every house looked like it could hide the same horror I had witnessed. I passed the house across the street, and for a split second, I thought I saw a movement behind a curtain. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the ordinary exterior of a suburban home. But the seed of dread had been planted. I could feel it growing, a gnawing awareness that whatever had appeared at that window was not confined to the night, that it could be anywhere, watching, waiting. That evening I tried something desperate. I shut all the curtains, turned on every light, and sat in the middle of my living room, hoping to convince myself I was safe. But as midnight passed, the red glow began to leak beneath the edges of the curtains, crawling across the floor like molten blood. My pulse raced as I realized it was no longer contained within the other house. It was here. It was everywhere. Then I saw the mark on the wall. Faint at first, almost invisible, but unmistakable. Long, thin scratches, etched deep into the plaster, forming a pattern that made no sense. I felt my stomach churn as I recognized the silhouette of the figure, stretched impossibly across the wall, tall and faceless. The scratches weren't there before. They hadn't existed yesterday. Someone or something had been inside my house while I slept, leaving its signature behind. I wanted to leave, to run far away, but the feeling of being watched made it impossible. Every step toward the door felt like wading through thick, unseen hands. My breathing grew shallow, and a cold sweat dripped down my back. I stayed in the middle of the living room, clutching my knees, eyes darting toward the curtains. I knew the figure would return, and when it did, I would have no choice but to confront the nightmare that had already invaded my life. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the red light flared again, brighter than ever, pulsing with an urgency that made my vision swim. I couldn't look away, and then, for the first time, I thought I saw it smile, or what should have been a smile, but its face was empty, completely blank. And in that moment I understood that this was only the beginning. The nights had become unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, the red light haunted me, and every shadow in my house seemed to twist into shapes I couldn't recognize. Sleep was a distant memory. I wandered through my home like a ghost, half-conscious, my body moving on instinct, while my mind hovered somewhere between fear and exhaustion. I could feel it everywhere, behind the walls, beneath the floorboards, in the corners of every room. The figure from across the street, or whatever it had become, was no longer just in the window. It had followed me. I tried to leave the house that evening, hoping that distance would break its hold over me. I stepped outside into the quiet streets. The familiar neighborhood now transformed into something alien, something hostile. The houses were still neat and orderly, the lawns still trimmed, but there was a suffocating stillness, as if the world had held its breath. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, too loud, too deliberate, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting the shape to appear at the end of the street. It wasn't there at first. Relief washed over me, brief and fragile, and I dared to breathe again. But then I saw it. Not across the street, not in a window, but standing silently at the edge of my neighbor's yard, taller than any human. Its faceless head tilted slightly as though studying me, waiting for me to move. I froze, unable to do anything but stare, feeling the darkness pressing against my chest. It didn't approach, didn't make a sound, but the moment I saw it, I knew that whatever it was, it had no need for doors or boundaries. I ran, my feet pounded the asphalt, my lungs burned, but every turn led me to the same place. The streets looped back on themselves in impossible ways, the familiar suburban grid twisting into a maze designed to trap me. Each house I passed seemed to stare back at me, the windows like black eyes, and somewhere, deep in the shadows, I could sense movement. Something was following, circling, waiting for me to grow tired, to falter. By the time I returned to my own house, the sun had already set, though the darkness outside felt wrong, thicker, almost tactile, like a heavy curtain pressing against the walls. I slammed the door behind me, checked the locks, and sank to the floor, heart hammering, sweat streaming down my face. But the house no longer felt like mine. Every creak of the floorboards was a warning, every gust of wind rattling the windows a threat. I could feel its presence moving through the rooms, unseen but undeniable. Then I noticed it. The mirrors. They were everywhere now, though I had never owned them in such quantity. In the hallway, in the bathroom, leaning against the walls in the living room. I couldn't remember bringing them in, and each one reflected the figure. No matter where I stood, it appeared behind me. Sometimes closer, sometimes stretching impossibly tall, always faceless, always silent. I tried covering them, turning them to the walls, but the reflections persisted, as though the mirrors had a mind of their own. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. Even breathing felt like a risk, like drawing air might summon it closer. I spent hours staring at the mirrors, watching, waiting, praying it would vanish. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In one reflection, my own face began to change. My eyes darkened, my skin grew pale and my features blurred, melting into the same featureless visage that haunted the reflections. I recoiled, stumbling backward, but the image persisted. It was then that I understood. It wasn't just observing me, it was rewriting me, shaping me into something else, something faceless, something not human. I wasn't safe in my own house anymore. There was no safety, no refuge. The suburbs had become a cage, and I was the prey. By the time the clock struck to 14 a.m., the red glow returned, creeping across the walls like liquid fire. The mirrors reflected it, multiplied it, until every corner of the room was bathed in crimson. I pressed myself against the far wall, shivering, knowing I couldn't escape it, and then I saw it move through the mirrors, sliding silently, impossibly, toward me. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. As it reached the mirror nearest me, the reflection smiled. Not a human smile, but a grotesque, impossible twist of emptiness. My own face, distorted, featureless, stared back at me, and in that moment, I realized the terrifying truth. I was not just being watched, I was becoming part of it, and in the shadows, the mirrors whispered my name, or at least what they claimed I would become. I could no longer tell what was real. The nights bled into days, and the days seemed hollow, as if the world outside my house had ceased to exist. Every street I walked, every corner I turned, that led me back to the same impossible place. My own home, or what it had become. The house felt different now, alien in its familiarity. The walls pulsed faintly with a red hue, shadows bending and stretching along them. The mirrors were everywhere, and no matter how I tried to cover or hide them, reflections of the figure stared back at me from every angle, multiplying endlessly, impossible to escape. I had tried to sleep, tried to convince myself that closing my eyes would shut it out, but the moment darkness fell, the red light returned. This time, it was stronger, almost alive, bleeding through the curtains and across the floorboards, twisting the air around it. My heart pounded as I felt the presence moving through the rooms, not through doors or windows, but through the very walls. It knew where I was, always. I could hear faint whispers, indistinct but urgent, crawling along the edges of my mind, filling me with dread I could not name. I tried to leave again, desperate, but the streets mocked me. Every turn brought me back to the same place. I passed house after house, all identical, all empty, all silently watching. I realized then that the neighborhood had trapped me, not just physically, but mentally. My sense of time, space, and direction had collapsed. Even the sun seemed to mock me, never fully rising, casting a dim gray light that offered no warmth. At home, the mirrors continued to multiply. I noticed them leaning in places I had never put them, reflecting rooms that didn't exist. In one, I saw the basement, the same basement from the house across the street, filled with dark water and shadows writhing just beneath the surface. I felt my stomach twist as I realized the reflection was showing me things that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps things that had already happened, but I had forgotten. And then I saw the figure. Not in the reflection, not in a window, but here, in the corner of my living room. Taller, darker, faceless, and somehow more solid than it had ever appeared before. I froze, knowing I could not move without inviting it closer. Its presence pressed down on me, heavy and oppressive, and I felt my own body weakening under its gaze. I was trembling, shaking uncontrollably, and yet I could not tear my eyes away. The air around me began to hum, low and guttural, vibrating through my bones. I tried to breathe, tried to think, but the sound filled every corner of the room, drowning out reason. I could feel it, crawling over me, inside me, like it was reaching into my very blood. My hands tingled, my vision blurred, and I realized with a cold clarity that it was not just watching me anymore, it was claiming me. I stumbled backward, crashing into a wall, my head spinning, my body numb. The mirrors reflected my own distorted, featureless face staring back at me, and I understood with terror that this was my future. I was becoming like it. My body, my identity, my very self, was slipping away into the faceless void I had been running from. Time ceased to exist. The red light pulsated faster, almost frantically, and shadows began crawling along the ceiling and walls like living things. My own reflection reached out, its featureless hands pressing against the glass as if trying to pull me in. I tried to resist, tried to fight back, But I had no strength left. The mirrors surrounded me, multiplying endlessly, trapping me in a corridor of reflections that stretched into infinity. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The humming ceased. The red glow faded to a dull, throbbing pulse. The mirrors were gone, leaving only the empty walls of my home. I fell to the floor, gasping, unable to comprehend whether I was alive or still trapped in some nightmare. For a moment I felt relief, fleeting and fragile. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Etched deep into my arm, glowing faintly red, was a mark I had never seen before. It pulsed like a heartbeat, spreading slowly up my veins, as if the figure had left a part of itself inside me. I could feel it moving, reshaping me, claiming me from the inside. And somewhere, just beyond the walls of my house, I sensed another presence, another pair of eyes watching, waiting. I wasn't alone. The suburbs had claimed me, and I was no longer sure whether I was the hunter or the hunted. As the clock ticked toward to 14 a.m., I realized with horror that the nightmare was not over. It had only grown stronger, more insistent, more personal. And somewhere deep in the silence, I understood that my home, my neighborhood, and even my own body were no longer mine to control. I tried to leave. I packed my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, dragging bags I barely remembered packing. Every instinct screamed at me to drive, to escape the nightmare that had consumed my life. But the streets refused to obey. Every turn, every lane, every familiar intersection led me back to the same houses, the same lawns, the same street I had been trapped on for weeks, or was it months? I no longer knew. Time had stretched and twisted into something unrecognizable, a limbo that existed only to hold me. Panic set in as I realized I could not leave. I tried driving in circles, tried taking back alleys, tried heading in directions I knew didn't exist on any map. It was pointless. The neighborhood was a trap, a labyrinth designed to hold me forever. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and the red pulsing mark on my arm throbbed like a second heartbeat. It had grown larger, spreading, connecting with veins I hadn't even noticed before. I could feel it moving beneath my skin, like roots taking hold inside me. I abandoned the car and ran on foot, hoping that by some miracle I could break free. But every step led me past the same house. The one that had first drawn my gaze, the one that had begun all of this. Its windows glowed red, the same impossible pulsing light that had haunted my nights. I didn't dare look inside, but I felt it anyway, something alive, patient, and aware. And then I realized with a sinking horror, the light was coming from my own home. My body had returned there while I wandered the streets. Somehow I had become both outside and inside, trapped in a space I could not control. I stumbled back to my yard, my legs weak and trembling. The street was silent. The air felt thick, almost solid, and a faint hum reverberated from the houses, low and insistent, like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. I glanced at the windows around me, and my stomach dropped. Reflections of myself stared back from every pane of glass, faceless, twisting, not quite human. They moved on their own, shifting slightly when I wasn't looking, waiting, observing. I could feel them whispering, though the sound was not audible, an impression of thought pressing into my mind, urging me closer to them, urging me to join them. I understood, in a moment of terrifying clarity, that I was no longer the person I had been. My identity had been rewritten, reshaped by the presence that had haunted me. The faceless figure from across the street had been patient, persistent, waiting for me to reach the point where I could no longer resist. And now it had claimed me, not completely yet, but enough to know that escape was impossible. I was becoming part of it, an extension of the thing I had feared, a faceless reflection waiting in the windows of someone else's house. And then, the unimaginable happened. I looked across the street at a house I didn't recognize, but the windows were the same. Inside, a new figure stood tall, thin, faceless, bathed in red light. It raised a hand, and in that instant I realized with gut-wrenching horror that it was me. The figure in the window was my reflection, my face erased, my body twisted, watching someone else, the next victim, the next watcher. I ran back inside, trying to hide, trying to resist, but the mirrors were everywhere now. My own reflection reached out to me from the glass, faceless hands pressing against the surface. The pulsing mark on my arm flared, and I could feel it spreading, crawling up my neck, down my legs, consuming me from the inside. I screamed, but no sound came. My body convulsed, and I could feel consciousness slipping away, merging with the red glow, with the faceless void. By the time the clock struck to 14 a.m., I was no longer entirely myself. Part of me was watching from the windows, part of me was trapped in the mirrors, and part of me still felt the last remnants of fear and awareness. Somewhere, just beyond the walls of the neighborhood, I sensed another pair of eyes watching. The cycle had begun again. The suburbs had claimed another observer, another participant in the endless, faceless nightmare. And as the red light pulsed, as the mirrors reflected infinity, I understood the truth with unbearable clarity. The horror would never end. I was not alone, and I would never leave. Not really. The streets, the houses, the mirrors, and the red glow, they were all alive, patient, and eternal. And now, so was I, somewhere out there. Someone else would look out their window tonight. and the light would appear, the figure would wait, and the cycle would continue. I had become part of it, faceless and eternal, a warning and a predator all at once in the suburbs. The suburbs were not safe, they had never been safe. The last thing I felt before fully surrendering was the sensation of being watched by myself, by the house, by something older and hungrier than I could ever imagine. And then darkness swallowed everything, leaving only the faint pulsing red mark glowing in the distance, waiting for the next eyes to meet it.